Chapter 1. A child in the shadow of kings. In the northern kingdom of Macedonia, nestled between hills and ancient forests, a child was born beneath skies once believed to touch the gods. His name was Alexander, son of King Philip II and Queen Olympias. From the moment he drew breath, the world around him hummed with tension and power. The palace he called home was no gentle refuge, it was a place of armor, clinking in the halls, of maps spread across tables, of voices raised in strategy and succession. Alexander was not raised like other boys. His father was a formidable king, a master of war and diplomacy, who had united the often fractured Greek city-states through force and clever alliances. His mother, Olympias, came from the royal house of Epirus, and with her came tales of gods and heroes, of bloodlines stretching back to Achilles and Heracles. She told Alexander he was destined for more than a throne. He was not just a prince, she whispered, he was the descendant of greatness, meant to blaze through history like lightning across a storm-dark sky. Even as a boy, he listened intently, absorbing every story, every myth. But while others may have grown vain under such flattery, Alexander grew hungry not for praise, but for understanding. He learned to ride horses before he could write his name, trained with sword and spear before most boys learned to swim. He watched his father lead troops, saw how kings gave orders and soldiers obeyed. Yet something in him longed for more than military conquest. When he was 13, his father summoned a teacher who would change his life, Aristotle, the great philosopher of Athens. It was not a conventional match. Aristotle had studied under Plato and believed in the power of reason above all. But Philip saw the potential in shaping his son's mind just as carefully as his body. And so, beneath the canopy of trees in a quiet grove near Mysa, Alexander sat and listened. Aristotle did not speak of warfare or power. He spoke of questions. What makes a life good? What is justice? What lies beyond the stars? He taught Alexander to think in terms of causes and effects, of nature and purpose. He introduced him to Homer's Iliad, not just as poetry, but as a mirror for a young prince's soul. Alexander came to see Achilles not as a legend, but as a model, flawed, brilliant, brave, and tragic. In the pages of books and the silence between lessons, Alexander's imagination grew vast. He began to dream of lands not yet known, of rivers beyond the borders of Greece, of people who spoke strange tongues and lived under different suns. He wanted not only to rule, but to see, to understand, to bring order where there was chaos, and beauty where there was ruin. He was not without pride, he knew his lineage, his intellect, and his promise, but it was ambition, not arrogance, that burned in him. When he spoke to his friends, he spoke not of wealth or ease, but of adventure, of proving oneself through action, through legacy. Even as he trained in combat and rode alongside his father on military reviews, he kept close the lessons of Aristotle. Philosophy tempered his fire, gave shape to his will. He grew into a boy both fierce and thoughtful, quick to act but slower to judge. Soldiers respected him. Scholars admired him. By 16, he was already commanding troops, putting down revolts, and showing the first signs of the leadership that would one day shake the world. And yet, despite his accomplishments, there was still something restless within him, a longing that no Macedonian field could satisfy. He studied Persian customs, Egyptian law, and Indian myths, believing deeply that knowledge was the true path to greatness. While others sought victory, he sought meaning. While others saw the edge of the known world as a boundary, Alexander saw it as a beginning. There was a moment small and unrecorded when he stood at the edge of the Aegean Sea. Wind in his hair, eyes on the horizon. He did not speak. He simply watched, as if the waves themselves carried messages from distant shores. To those who knew him then, it was clear Alexander was not content to remain a footnote in his father's story. He was writing his own, slowly, deliberately, shaped by myth, by philosophy, and by the quiet certainty that one day his name would be spoken not just in Macedonia, but across every land where people looked up at the stars and wondered what lay beyond in the years to come. That boy would become a man whose footsteps echoed across continents. But it all began here, in a palace full of ambition, beneath the gaze of watchful gods, and in the mind of a child who believed that greatness was not a gift, but a destiny to be carved by hand, one decision at a time. Chapter 2. The Death That Changed Everything. By the time Alexander was 16, he was no longer just a prince in waiting, he was already a leader. While his father, King Philip II, was away on campaign, a rebellion rose in the northern region of Medi. Most rulers would have sent a general to handle such unrest, but Alexander took command himself. He marched with a small force, put down the revolt swiftly, and founded a city on the conquered ground, naming it Alexandropolis. It was a quiet but clear message. He was not simply watching history unfold. He was shaping it. This early success was not only a testament to his military instincts, but also a sign of the trust Philip placed in his young son. The bond between father and son, however complex, had always been defined by mutual ambition. Philip was a brilliant commander and visionary, having transformed Macedonia from a minor kingdom into a dominant power in Greece. He had forged alliances, subdued rivals, and laid the foundations of a campaign to conquer the Persian Empire. Alexander had watched it all, absorbing lessons in both war and rule. But in 336 BCE, everything changed. In the city of Tyre, during the celebration of his daughter's wedding, King Philip was assassinated. The killer, a royal bodyguard named Pausania, struck swiftly and was killed almost immediately while trying to flee. The reasons for the murder remained debated. Some whispered of personal revenge, others of political intrigue, but one truth emerged. Clearly, in the aftermath, Macedonia was vulnerable. A powerful king was gone, and in his place stood a 20-year-old. In that moment, the world held its breath. Crowns are not simply passed, they are claimed, often in blood. Alexander understood this. Within hours of his father's death, he moved decisively. First, he secured the loyalty of the Macedonian army, many of whom had served under his father. He promised continuity, but made it clear that he was his own ruler. Then, he turned to the court, eliminating rivals and potential claimants to the throne. His mother, Olympias, played her part, ensuring that dissent within the palace was silenced. It was swift, brutal, and necessary. Rule demanded not just vision, but control. Greece, always fractious and proud, tested him next. Thebes doubted his strength, as did Athens and Thessaly, but Alexander did not hesitate. He marched south with his army, reminding the city-states that the Macedonian grip remained firm. In Thessaly, he trapped opposing forces in a mountain pass, forcing their surrender without bloodshed. In Thebes, a city known for its resistance, he took a harder line. When Thebes rebelled, Alexander responded with overwhelming force, destroying much of the city and sparing only temples and houses of poets. It was a calculated act, one that sent a message to all of Greece. Loyalty was not optional. Athens, seeing the fate of Thebes, chose diplomacy over defiance. Within a year, Alexander had done what few believed possible. He secured his throne, unified the Greek states under Macedonian leadership, and stood ready to carry forward his father's greatest ambition, the conquest of Persia. It was more than a military campaign. It was a mission that had lived in his mind since childhood, shaped by stories of Achilles and the dream of uniting East and West. Persia was vast, rich, and ancient. It had defeated Greek forces before, burned Athens, and ruled over lands that stretched from the Aegean Sea to the mountains of India. But Alexander did not fear its size. He saw its age not as a strength, but as a weight. To him, Persia was a colossus built on fading glory, waiting to be challenged. Preparing for war, he called together his generals and veterans, men who had served with Philip and fought in Greece. He reminded them that they were not just Macedonians, they were the future, rulers of an empire. He inspired them with talk of honor, of gold, of legacy. Yet beneath the speeches lay something deeper. Alexander was not just chasing conquest. He believed he was fulfilling a purpose, taking what his father had begun and elevating it beyond anyone's expectations. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander crossed into Asia Minor with a force of roughly 40,000 men. It was not the largest army ever assembled, but it was disciplined, loyal, and led by a commander who fought at its front. As he stepped onto Asian soil, he visited the legendary city of Troy. There, he laid a wreath at the tomb of Achilles and took up a shield said to belong to the ancient hero. It was symbolic, but for Alexander, symbols mattered. He believed in destiny, in the power of myth guiding action. As his men looked on, they saw not just a young king, they saw a figure stepping into history, prepared to write his own epic. The journey ahead would test them all. But Alexander had already faced his greatest trial, not on the battlefield, but in the wake of his father's death. He had seized power in a moment of chaos, outmaneuvered rivals, crushed rebellions, and brought together a divided land. Now, with Greece behind him and Persia before him, he was no longer merely the son of a king. He was a king reborn through fire, ready to challenge an empire. The death of Philip had changed everything. It had taken away a father, a mentor, a monarch, but it had also unleashed something fierce and unrelenting in Alexander, the resolve to surpass what had come before, to prove that his crown was not a gift, but a claim earned through action. And as his boots pressed into foreign soil, the boy who had once listened to Aristotle beneath the trees was gone. In his place stood a man who believed that the world was his to shape. Chapter 3: Crossing into the Unknown. In the spring of 334 BCE, as the winds shifted across the Aegean Sea in the morning, mist hung over the coast of Macedon. Alexander stepped onto a ship that would carry him across the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia. For most, it was a body of water like any other, but to Alexander, it was the symbolic threshold between the familiar and the vast unknown. He was 22 years old, in command of an army of 40,000 men, and for the first time in his life, He was leaving the land of his birth to enter a world built on ancient empires, distant gods, and forgotten cities. Before he advanced into Persian territory, Alexander paused on the shores of Troy. He believed deeply in the legacy of Homer's heroes. And Troy was not simply a historical site to him, it was sacred ground. He approached the supposed tomb of Achilles, his childhood hero, and offered gifts in solemn reverence. According to tradition, he ran a race around the grave with his closest companions, imitating the funeral games from the Iliad. He took with him a shield, said to be a relic from the Trojan War, a reminder that he was not just entering foreign soil, he was entering legend. Yet he had little time for ceremony. The Persian satraps, local governors under King Darius III, had gathered an army to confront the Macedonians near the banks of the Granicus River. They believed they could crush the invading force early, using their superior cavalry and fortified positions. But Alexander had studied the terrain, observed their tactics, and refused to play their game. Rather than wait for safer conditions, he ordered an immediate attack. His generals hesitated. The river was fast and swollen with spring runoff. The Persians waited on the opposite bank, well-positioned and confident. Yet Alexander saw opportunity where others saw danger. At the head of his companion cavalry, he charged across the water, shouting to his men to follow. Arrows rained down as the Macedonians struggled through the current, but they pressed on. Once they reached the far bank, chaos erupted. The Persians, expecting hesitation, were caught off guard by the ferocity of the attack. Alexander fought in the thick of it, his white-plumed helmet marking him like a beacon amid the clash of steel. He personally killed several high-ranking Persian nobles, his spear moving with precision and force. His horse was struck and fell beneath him, but he rose and continued fighting. His presence inspired his troops, and the Macedonian phalanx followed with discipline and deadly rhythm. Within hours, the Persian army was broken. Thousands were killed, and many more fled into the interior. Victory at Granicus was decisive, not just militarily, but psychologically. It proved that the Persians were vulnerable, that the so-called invincible empire could be wounded. It also sent a message to the Greek cities under Persian. Control liberation was possible, and Alexander was its herald. After the battle, Alexander treated the wounded with care and ensured that the bodies of the fallen were buried with respect. He sent 300 suits of captured Persian armor back to Athens as a gift to the goddess Athena, with an inscription declaring they had been taken from the barbarians of Asia. His use of symbolism was deliberate. He was not just fighting a war of swords, he was waging a war of ideas, of cultures, of identities. From Granicus, he moved swiftly through Western Asia Minor, taking city after city. Some welcomed him as a liberator, others resisted and faced siege. In Sardis, the local rulers surrendered immediately, offering the city and its treasury without a fight. In Miletus, resistance was crushed with a carefully coordinated naval blockade. Halicarnassus, however, proved more stubborn. There, Alexander faced a well-defended city fortified by a skilled Greek mercenary general in service to Persia. The siege was long and difficult, but Alexander's determination never wavered. Eventually, Memnon burned the city and withdrew, unable to defeat the Macedonian persistence. Each conquest brought new challenges, supply lines to manage, local politics to navigate, languages to interpret. But Alexander moved through them with remarkable energy and clarity. He replaced defeated governors with his own men or with local allies, who pledged loyalty. He respected regional customs, avoided unnecessary cruelty, and sought to present himself not merely as a conqueror, but as a rightful ruler. Still, the deeper he moved into Asia, the more he realized that this was only the beginning. The Persian Empire was a vast mosaic of peoples and provinces, stretching far beyond the horizon. What lay ahead were mountain ranges, deserts, and cities older than anything in Greece. Alexander knew he could not falter. He had to continue forward, not only for conquest, but for a vision he held tightly of a world connected under one rule, one law, one idea. His men, though loyal, began to feel the weight of distance. Letters from home grew rarer. The terrain became unfamiliar. But Alexander led from the front, sharing their hardships, sleeping in the same camps, eating the same food. His charisma was not theatrical, it was constant, a steady presence that assured his army they were part of something greater than themselves. In the cities he passed, he often spared temples and promoted local worship, acknowledging the gods of the land. He was already beginning to imagine a new kind of empire, one that blended traditions rather than simply imposed them. Yet none of this could have happened without that first bold step, the decision to cross the Hellespont, to step into the unknown, to embrace uncertainty as the path to greatness. What to others had seemed like a simple crossing had, for Alexander, marked the true beginning of his journey. Every battle he would fight, every city he would build, every challenge he would face, all of it flowed from that moment, when he stood at the edge of Europe and looked across the water into the heart of Asia. The Granicus had shown that Macedon could fight. The months that followed would show that Alexander could lead not just an army, but a vision. And still, he knew that Persia's heart lay deeper inland, guarded by greater armies and older cities. What he had achieved was impressive, but it was only the first stroke on a much larger canvas. He was not marching for a single battle, or even for a single empire. He was marching toward a world yet to be imagined. Chapter 4. The Storm at Issus. As Alexander moved steadily south through the rugged lands of Anatolia, his momentum did not falter. City after city opened its gates to him, some persuaded by diplomacy, others by the fate they saw fall upon those who resisted. The Macedonian army, though smaller than the Persian forces they would face, advanced with discipline, precision, and growing confidence. Yet despite these early victories, Alexander knew he had not yet truly faced the empire's heart. The satraps he had defeated were regional commanders. The true test would come from the great king himself. And in the autumn of 333 BCE, that moment arrived. Darius III, king of Persia, assembled a vast army drawn from every corner of his sprawling empire. Medes, Babylonians, Egyptians, Scythians, and more. His numbers far exceeded Alexander's, and with them came the weight of Persian pride, history, and royal command. Confident that he would crush the invading Macedonians in one decisive blow, Darius advanced into the region of Cilicia, narrowing the gap between his forces and Alexander's. The two armies met near the town of Issus, at the mouth of a narrow coastal plain pinned between the mountains and the sea. The terrain was tight, ill-suited for the maneuverability of the enormous Persian force. It was a stroke of fortune for Alexander, whose smaller, highly organized army could exploit such confinement. As the battle began, the weather turned foul, mud formed in deep ruts, and confusion spread quickly through the Persian ranks. Alexander, always fighting near the front, recognized the moment. He did not hesitate. Leading his companion cavalry, he surged toward the Persian center, aiming not at the masses of infantry, but at Darius himself. It was a bold move, risky by any standard, yet consistent with Alexander's belief that victory could be achieved, not just through force, but by striking at the head. As they cut through the enemy lines, the Macedonians created chaos. Darius, positioned high on a chariot, surrounded by elite guards, saw the charge coming. For a moment, he held his ground, but then, as the Macedonian cavalry broke through the protective ranks, panic swept the field. The great king turned and fled. His chariot was abandoned, his royal standard left behind. As news of the king's retreat spread, the Persian army collapsed in disarray. Soldiers who moments earlier had stood proudly under the imperial banner now ran for their lives. The rout was complete. Thousands were cut down in the retreat, while others drowned in the nearby river or were trampled in the chaos. But it was what happened after the battle that revealed another side of Alexander's leadership. In the Persian royal camp, abandoned in the haste of retreat, Alexander's forces found Darius's immediate family, his wife, mother, and daughters. According to some accounts, the queen believed they were to be killed or enslaved. Instead, Alexander treated them with the utmost respect. He ordered that no harm come to them, ensured their comfort and safety, and addressed the queen mother with the title Mother, a sign of honor and cultural understanding. His decision was not merely kind, it was strategic. By treating the royal family with dignity, Alexander sent a clear message to the empire. He was dismantling. He was not a barbarian invader, but a new kind of ruler, one who sought legitimacy as much as victory. The act gained him admiration, not only among the Greeks, but even among many Persians who had begun to see in Alexander a figure of justice and balance. Meanwhile, he buried the Macedonian dead with honor, visited the wounded, and walked among his troops as an equal. His presence was constant. He was not a distant commander, but a living symbol of their cause. The Battle of Issus was more than just a military success. It marked a turning point in the campaign, shifting the momentum firmly into Alexander's hands. Darius's retreat damaged Persian morale, and for the first time, the empire appeared vulnerable. The loss of the king's family and royal insignia further eroded the perception of Persian invincibility. Word spread quickly across the known world. In cities still under Persian control, governors and satraps began to weigh their loyalty. Some secretly sent envoys to Alexander, hoping to avoid the wrath of war. Others fled or fortified their cities, anticipating the march of the Macedonian army. As Alexander paused after Issus, he did not celebrate recklessly. He knew that Darius still lived and that the road ahead would demand greater endurance, deeper diplomacy, and even harder battles. But he also understood the symbolism of the moment. By defeating the great king in direct combat, forcing him to flee and capturing his family unharmed, Alexander had transformed the psychological landscape of the war. He was no longer just a daring young commander from the edge of Greece, was now a contender for the imperial crown. He used this momentum wisely. In letters, he reminded the Greek world that he had fulfilled his promise to avenge the Persian invasion of Greece from a century before. He presented himself not only as a military hero, but as the protector of Hellenic pride. Yet his mind was already moving beyond revenge. He envisioned a new order, a merging of East and West under a rule, not based solely on fear or tradition, but on strength, respect, and shared destiny. The storm at Issus had passed, but it had reshaped the terrain of power. The mud of that battlefield had soaked the boots of kings and soldiers alike. But only one figure emerged, taller. Alexander stood at the threshold of something far greater than conquest. He had wounded an empire, shaken a king, and begun the slow, careful process of becoming not merely a destroyer of worlds, but the architect of a new one. Chapter 5. Tyre, the unyielding island. After the triumph at Issus, Alexander turned his focus south, marching along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean with his army. City after city opened its gates, some out of fear, others out of calculation. They knew the fate of those who resisted. Phoenician ports, rich with trade and steeped in seafaring history, either welcomed him or were quickly subdued. His goal was to secure the coast before pushing deeper into Persian territory, ensuring no city could rise behind him or threaten his supply lines. Then came Tyre, located about half a mile off the coast. The city stood proud on its island, surrounded by high stone walls that rose straight out of the sea. Tyre had been a powerful maritime force for centuries, its ships and merchants known across the ancient world. It was more than just a city, it was a symbol of independence and pride, a jewel in the Phoenician world, and it refused to bow to any conqueror. When Alexander sent messengers, requesting entry to offer sacrifice at the temple of Mount, the Tyrians denied him. They said he was welcome to worship, but only from the mainland. To them, the island was sacred, untouchable, invincible. They believed their walls and the sea itself would protect them, as they had for generations. But Alexander was not deterred. He saw Tyre not as an obstacle, but as a challenge that had to be overcome. Leaving it behind would mean leaving a defiant power in his rear, one that could easily become a Persian stronghold. So, in one of the boldest feats of military engineering in ancient history, he ordered a causeway, a massive land bridge, to be constructed from the mainland to the island. At first, it seemed impossible. The waters were deep and the distance daunting. But Alexander's engineers and soldiers worked tirelessly, dragging stones from the ruins of the mainland city and from nearby quarries, piling them into the sea, creating a growing path toward the fortress. Day by day, the causeway stretched farther into the water, turning blue waves into a battlefield. The Tyrians, skilled sailors, did not remain idle. They launched fire ships to burn the Macedonian towers. They rained arrows and projectiles from their walls. Divers swam beneath the surface to dislodge stones. Their navy harassed the builders constantly, turning the construction site into a deadly zone of chaos and resistance. But Alexander responded with equal ingenuity. He brought in ships from nearby conquered cities, assembling a fleet to challenge Tyre's dominance at sea. He built siege towers directly on the growing causeway, arming them with catapults and protective screens. Day after day, his army inched forward, even as men fell to fire, arrows, and exhaustion. The siege dragged on for 7 long months. Supplies had to be carefully managed. Morale was tested, but Alexander remained steadfast. He visited the work sites personally, encouraged his men, and adapted to every new tactic the Tyrians used. Eventually, his fleet gained control of the waters surrounding the island, blockading it from the sea. With both land and sea against them, the defenders began to falter. Finally, the walls were breached. Macedonian soldiers stormed through the city in a wave of fury and relief. The battle within the walls was fierce, but the outcome was never in doubt. Tyre, the city that had believed itself beyond reach, had fallen. Alexander did not show mercy. Thousands of men were killed during and after the assault. Many survivors were captured and sold into slavery. The city that had stood so proudly against him was left shattered, its pride broken, its streets marked by fire and ruin. Some sources claim that Alexander allowed the citizens who had sought refuge in the temples to live, honoring the sanctity of their gods. Others suggest his wrath was total, shaped by the long resistance and the losses his army had suffered. Regardless, the message was clear: resistance would be crushed, no matter how long it took or how strong the walls. But even in conquest, there was calculation. Alexander understood that the fall of Tyre would echo far beyond its shores. It sent a message to the rest of the Levant, to Egypt, to every satrap still loyal to Persia. It declared that no fortress was too strong, no city too distant, and no sea too deep to stand against his ambition. The causeway remained long after the siege, eventually turning the island into a peninsula. It stood as a monument, not just to military strength, but to persistence, engineering, and the unwavering will of a commander who refused to accept the word impossible. For Alexander, the siege of Tyre was not just a victory of arms, it was a test of character, endurance, and leadership. He had stared down the limits of geography and defied them. He had taken a city that believed itself untouchable and made it a stepping stone on his journey toward empire. The conquest of Tyre marked the end of Phoenician resistance and opened the path to Egypt, with the sea now under Macedonian control and his legend growing with every mile. Alexander marched on, not content with the cities behind him, but drawn ever forward by the promise of what lay ahead. The unyielding island had yielded at last, and the tide of history continued to rise in his name. Chapter 6. Egypt and the Oracle of the Desert. In the winter of 332 BCE, after months of siege and bloodshed, Alexander turned his army southward and entered Egypt not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. The Persian satraps who had ruled the land for generations were gone, their authority shattered by years of resentment and recent defeats. To the Egyptians, who long remembered their own dynasties, Alexander was not merely another foreign invader, he was a new force, untainted by the brutal policies of the Persian overlords. Temples were reopened, priests emerged to bless him, crowds gathered in the streets. He allowed their traditions to flourish, respected their deities, and even took part in their rituals. To the people along the Nile, it felt like the return of balance, of Mat, the sacred harmony long disrupted. Alexander, ever aware of symbolism, embraced this welcome. He moved not with arrogance, but with care, presenting himself not only as a Greek leader, but as a rightful pharaoh, a bringer of order. While in Egypt, he chose a strategic location along the Mediterranean coast, just west of the Nile Delta, and laid the foundations for a new city. He named it Alexandria. It would serve as a beacon of trade, culture, and learning, linking Greece and Egypt, east and west. Its streets were planned by his engineers, its harbors carefully chosen for access to sea routes, its temples and marketplaces drawn from both Greek and Egyptian designs, though still only a plan etched in sand. Alexandria would one day rise to become one of the most important cities of the ancient world. But while politics and statecraft occupied much of his time, something deeper stirred within Alexander. He had conquered cities, faced kings, and crossed deserts. But now, in the silence of Egypt, he began to search, not outward, but inward. Stories had long reached his ears of the Oracle of Ammon, located far across the desert at the Siwa oasis. This oracle, housed in a secluded temple, was said to speak the will of the gods, to answer questions not with riddles, but with clarity. It was sacred to both Egyptians and Greeks, who linked Ammon with Zeus, the king of the gods. Many advised against the journey. The route was treacherous, the desert endless, the water scarce. But Alexander was not dissuaded. He gathered a small entourage and set out across the western desert, enduring scorching days and freezing nights, guided at times by stars, at times by instinct. Legend says that during the journey, a pair of ravens flew ahead of him, showing the path when the trail disappeared in the dunes. Others claimed a sudden rainstorm saved the group when their water ran low, a sign of divine favor. Whether myth or memory, the desert did not stop him. And then, at last, he arrived at Siwa, surrounded by palms and cool springs. The temple stood like a secret held by the earth itself. There, in its inner sanctum, he met the priests and entered the chamber of the oracle. What he asked, no one knows. The words were not recorded. The priests said the god had spoken, but neither Alexander nor his companions ever revealed the content of the exchange. Later, when asked, Alexander would only smile or speak cryptically. But what followed suggested that something profound had taken root in his mind. Soon after, he began to refer to himself in new terms, not just as king of Macedonia or commander of armies, but as son of Zeus. Some dismissed it as political theater, a way to assert divine right in lands where god-kings had ruled for centuries. Others believed he truly felt touched by something beyond the mortal world, that in the silence of the temple, he had glimpsed a destiny too vast for ordinary titles. The priests had addressed him in a way reserved for pharaohs and gods. Perhaps he had asked if he was truly the son of a mortal man, or if, as his mother, Olympias, once hinted, his birth had been touched by the divine. Whatever the truth, something shifted that day in the sand, when he emerged from the desert. He was not just a man who had crossed into Egypt, he was a figure of myth in the making. His army, though loyal, began to notice the change. There was a gravity to him now, as if he carried not only the weight of empire, but of fate itself. Some welcomed it. Others questioned it in private, but none could deny that their leader walked with a new sense of purpose. Before leaving Egypt, Alexander made offerings at temples and received official recognition as pharaoh. He did not impose Greek gods over the Egyptian pantheon, but allowed the two to intertwine. To some, he was the bringer of freedom. To others, a divine ruler blessed by both Zeus and Ammon. His image began to appear in temples, with ram's horns curling from his head, the symbol of Ammon. It was a merging of identities, part belief, part strategy, all ambition. Yet beneath the symbolism lay a truth. Alexander was no longer content with being a king of men. He had begun to see himself as something more, a bridge between worlds, between gods and mortals, between East and West. Egypt was not just a chapter in his campaign, it was a transformation. He had arrived as a warrior and would leave as a legend in progress, with the desert behind him and the Nile at his back. Alexander now turned his gaze once more toward Persia. Darius still ruled, still commanded armies, still claimed the throne. But Alexander had changed. He was no longer simply chasing victory, he was pursuing destiny. And whatever the oracle had whispered in that ancient temple, it had set him on a path that would carry him far beyond kingship, toward a legacy that even time could not easily erase. Chapter 7. Gaugamela and the Fall of an Empire. After his time in Egypt, Alexander turned his gaze once more to the east. He was no longer merely a general leading a campaign, he was a king with divine echoes in his titles, an empire builder whose victories had begun to feel inevitable. But the heart of Persia still beat in the distance, guarded by its king, Darius III, and by the pride of an empire that had endured for centuries. In the late summer of 331 BC, Alexander resumed his march through Mesopotamia. Cities like Gaza and Arbela yielded or fell. The land grew drier, the marches longer, and the anticipation heavier. Word spread that Darius had gathered a force unlike any before. It was said to be vast, stretching across the horizon, armed with chariots fitted with scythe blades, with archers and cavalry, with war elephants and soldiers, drawn from every corner of Persia's immense dominion. The great king had chosen the plains near Gaugamela for the final confrontation. There, under an open sky, he would make his stand. Alexander studied the battlefield carefully. The terrain had been cleared by Persian engineers to give the chariots full mobility. Darius had every advantage in numbers. But Alexander had something else: flexibility, cohesion, and strategy. He spent the night before the battle calmly, while Darius, it was said, watched the stars for omens. At dawn, Alexander rode out with his Macedonian phalanx at the center, cavalry on the flanks, and reserves ready behind. As the Persian lines stretched wide, trying to envelop him, he began a subtle lateral movement, drawing his troops diagonally to the right. It was not a retreat, it was a trap. Darius, fearing the loss of position, ordered an advance. The scythed chariots charged, but Alexander's men opened lanes, allowing the chariots to pass harmlessly through while his archers picked them off. The phalanx held firm, shields braced, pikes leveled. Then came the moment. Alexander saw the gap forming in the Persian center. He rode hard with his companion cavalry, straight into the heart of the line. Cutting through guards and nobles alike, the Persian formation buckled. For the second time in their long contest, Darius lost his nerve. He turned his chariot and fled, this time with even less order than before. His army saw the retreat and crumbled. Some resisted fiercely, others scattered. The field was thick with dust and confusion. But one truth was clear: Persia had lost. Gaugamela was more than a battle. It was the breaking of an empire. With his army shattered, Darius fled east, a king in name only. Alexander moved swiftly in the wake of victory. The great cities of Mesopotamia, once symbols of the empire's wealth and splendor, began to fall. Babylon, with its legendary walls and hanging gardens, opened its gates peacefully, its priests and nobles offering gifts and submission. Alexander entered the city not as a destroyer, but as a ruler. He respected its temples, addressed its people with dignity, and left its traditions intact. From there, he moved to Susa, another treasure house of Persian power. Its palace was filled with gold, silver, and artifacts collected over centuries. The wealth of Asia now lay in Alexander's hands. But it was in Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Persia, where the transformation became complete. Persepolis was not just a city, it was a symbol of the old order, of kings who had ruled with divine authority and unshakable pride. Its palaces were adorned with carvings of tribute from across the empire, its halls filled with the memory of past glories. When Alexander entered, he did so knowing he was walking into history's echo chamber. At first, he treated it with respect, but as the weeks passed, and as wine flowed and celebrations rose into the night, something shifted. In a drunken revel, whether spontaneous or calculated, the decision was made to burn the palace. Flames spread quickly, consuming the wooden beams, the curtains, the scrolls and artworks that had stood for centuries. Some accounts say a courtesan named Tyre urged the fire, others that Alexander himself threw the first torch. Whether it was vengeance for the burning of Athens a century earlier, or a ritual cleansing of the past, the message was unmistakable. The old world was ending. The pillars of Darius's empire fell beneath the smoke. Yet even as the fire crackled through Persepolis, Alexander's gaze was already looking forward. He knew the campaign was not finished. Darius still lived, though in flight, and the eastern satrapies remained but symbolically, the war had reached its climax. The treasures of Persia, the loyalty of its people, the very idea of imperial permanence, all had passed into new hands. That night, as the fire reflected off polished armor and the stars blinked above the mountains, Alexander stood at the peak of his triumph. But within him, something had shifted again. He was no longer just the avenger of Greece, nor the liberator of Egypt. He was now the inheritor of Persia's vast legacy, the architect of a new order. In the ashes of Persepolis, he had not merely destroyed a city, he had declared that the past must make way for the future. A Macedonian king had crossed into Asia as a warrior. At Gaugamela, he became a ruler of worlds, and from the ruins of empire, he would begin to build something even more audacious, a realm that sought to unite the ends of the earth under one vision, one law, and one enduring name. Chapter 8. The Pursuit and the Betrayal. Victory at Gaugamela could have marked the end of the war for any other man. But Alexander was not finished. Though Darius had fled, defeated and disgraced, he still held the title of great king, and as long as he lived, Alexander believed the Persian throne remained contested, with the major cities of the empire under his control and the wealth of Asia secured. He turned eastward, not in celebration, but in pursuit. The land changed as he advanced. Fertile plains gave way to harsher terrain. River valleys turned into mountains and deserts, and the air grew thinner and colder as he pressed into regions rarely touched by imperial power. His army, seasoned and loyal, followed through the high passes of Media and into the rugged landscapes of Parthia and Hyrcania. They endured scorching days and freezing nights, pressing forward on Alexander's a relentless mission to bring Darius to justice, not only for the sake of conquest, but to bring symbolic closure to a war that had reshaped the ancient world. But Alexander was not the only one hunting. Within Darius's shrinking circle, fear took root. Some of his satraps, once loyal governors of the empire's eastern provinces, began to question their future. Darius, now without the full force of an army and on the run, seemed more like a fugitive than a king. The pressures of pursuit, the collapsing authority of the Persian state, and the looming presence of Alexander's forces fractured the last threads of unity among the Persians. Among the satraps was Bessus, the governor of Bactria. Ambitious and calculating, Bessus convinced others that Darius was no longer fit to rule and that surrendering or killing him might buy favor with the advancing Macedonians, or even allow Bessus to claim the throne himself. Somewhere in the vastness of eastern Persia, the decision was made. Darius was seized, bound, and later stabbed, left to die on a cart in the dust. By the time Alexander reached him, it was too late. The King of Kings lay wrapped in a cloak, abandoned on the side of the road like a discarded burden. When Alexander saw him, he did not rejoice. He wept. He ordered that Darius's body be treated with full royal honors. A proper funeral was arranged, one that matched the dignity of a fallen monarch, not the ignominy of his murder. Alexander sent word to Darius's family, offering condolences and reaffirming his intent, not to erase the Persian royal legacy, but to absorb it into something greater. His grief was not only for the man, but for the missed moment, the chance to defeat Darius in person, to offer him mercy, and to unite the empire with a living symbol of its former king. That possibility was stolen by treachery, and it lit a fire in Alexander that would burn for years to come. Betrayal, to him, was a stain that could not be ignored. Justice was not a matter of convenience, it was personal. He vowed to find Bessus and those who had conspired in the murder, not just as an act of revenge, but as a declaration. Loyalty mattered, even in war, even among enemies. What followed was one of the most grueling campaigns of his life. Bessus had fled into the eastern provinces, into the wild and remote lands of Bactria and Sogdiana, territories known for their harsh climate and independent tribes. These were lands where empires faded into mountains, where resistance was a way of life, and where geography itself became an enemy. Alexander and his army gave chase, covering immense distances at a pace that seemed impossible. They crossed rivers swollen with glacial melt, climbed passes that scraped the clouds, and endured ambushes from those who resented any form of foreign rule. Yet Alexander pressed on. Each village, each outpost, each mountain trail was another step toward the traitors. Along the way, he did not merely conquer, he founded cities, secured alliances, and began planting the seeds of a future that stretched beyond the reach of Greece or Persia. Still, the hunt continued. When Bessus declared himself King of Kings and tried to rally support, Alexander responded with force and diplomacy alike. Some local leaders submitted, others resisted, but none could match the momentum of his campaign. Eventually, Bessus was betrayed by his own allies, captured, and delivered in chains to Alexander. But execution did not come immediately. First, Alexander had him publicly punished for his crimes, stripped of dignity, and displayed as a warning to all who might value ambition over loyalty. Only after this did he allow the final sentence to be carried out. Justice, in Alexander's view, was not swift, it was deliberate, visible, and tied to honor. With Bessus dead, the pursuit ended, but the campaign did not. The chase into the east had opened a new frontier, one where conquest would no longer be measured in cities taken or kings deposed, but in the deeper, more complex challenge of governing a land that defied easy rule. Alexander had become more than a commander. He was now a judge of kings, a lawgiver across cultures, and a man who carried both mercy and wrath in equal measure. The betrayal of Darius had taken from him a final battlefield, but it had also given him something else, a renewed sense of destiny. forged not in triumph alone, but in the pursuit of justice across the farthest reaches of the known world. Chapter 9. Roxana and the War of Hearts. The war should have ended with the fall of Darius and the death of Bessus. But in the highlands of Central Asia, what we now call Afghanistan, resistance did not fade. Instead, it transformed. The satraps and cities had fallen, but the mountains belonged to other masters, fierce tribes, hardened by generations of survival, unyielding and proud. They did not meet Alexander on open fields or behind city walls. They struck from shadows, vanished into canyons, and made the land itself their ally. In these steep passes and snow-dusted ridges, war became slower, more intimate, and more punishing. It was not just the blades of enemies that drained the strength of Alexander's army. It was the cold, the altitude, the endless climbing, the sense of always chasing but never catching. It was during this phase of the campaign that Alexander met Roxana. Her father was a Bactrian noble, perhaps a local chieftain, perhaps a minor satrap who had resisted, then yielded. The details vary, but the essence remains. She was young, intelligent, and striking in presence. In a world ruled by steel and strategy, Roxana represented something unexpected. Their meeting was not marked by conquest, but by ceremony. Some say Alexander saw, heard during a parley or celebration, and was struck immediately, not just by beauty, but by grace. Others say it was political, that marrying into a powerful local family would help pacify the region. Perhaps both are true. Their union became a symbol of Alexander's changing identity. To his men, many of whom had followed him from Macedonia across deserts and empires, it was confusing. He, the son of Philip, the pride of Pella, had taken a foreign bride. The marriage followed Persian customs, not Greek ones. There was no royal match arranged in the courts of Europe, only a bond forged in the high valleys of an unfamiliar land. And yet, it was deeply meaningful. Roxana was not a trophy. Alexander treated her with respect, made her his queen, and integrated her into his vision of a blended world. For Alexander, the marriage was more than romance or alliance, it was a statement. He was no longer merely the king of Macedonia or the conqueror of Persia. He was attempting something larger, to fuse the peoples of his growing empire into something unified, a single body drawn from many lands. To that end, he began adopting Persian customs more openly. He wore robes of Eastern design, sat on a throne in the manner of the great kings, and surrounded himself with advisors not only from Greece but from Persia, Bactria, and beyond. He appointed locals to high positions, married his officers to noble women from the region, and encouraged shared rituals. It was a calculated cultural synthesis, part diplomacy, part transformation. But not everyone followed. Among his Macedonian soldiers, murmurs grew. They had marched for years, fought and bled in foreign lands, only to see their king bow to customs they did not understand. They had once cheered his victories as the triumphs of Greece. Now they watched him vanish beneath silk robes, speaking to priests in foreign tongues, honoring gods they did not know. For many, it felt like a betrayal, not of tactics, but of identity. Alexander, they feared, was no longer one of them. And in a way, he wasn't. He had begun to drift into something new. Not Greek, not Persian, not entirely Eastern or Western. He was trying to become a bridge, an embodiment of a unified empire. born in battle and sustained by shared blood and custom. It was an audacious vision, one few before him had dared to imagine. Roxana, then, was more than a queen. She was the living symbol of that unity. In the privacy of their court, she likely offered perspective, insight into local customs, and counsel that no general could provide. Together, they represented the future Alexander sought, a world where difference did not divide but defined the strength of a greater whole. But the cost of this dream was growing. The war in the mountains dragged on. Victory was never total. Each rebellion crushed gave rise to another. His army grew weary. Homesickness settled into their bones. The men who had once cheered each new horizon now longed for the familiar skies of the west. Meanwhile, Alexander pushed deeper, building cities, planting colonies, leaving behind statues and laws like footprints across the terrain. He was not just fighting resistance, he was fighting time, momentum, and the fading patience of those who had followed him across continents. Still, he pressed on. He believed in his vision. He believed in his destiny. And through it all, Roxana remained by his side. In her, he found not only companionship, but a connection to the land he was trying to understand. She was neither prize nor peace offering. She was the thread he used to bind a fractured empire into something that could last beyond his life. In the mountains, Alexander had faced the hardest war, not of steel, but of hearts. The people did not want foreign rule. His men did not want foreign customs. And yet he sought to merge them all into one empire, one story, one future. Slowly, painfully, progress came. Fortresses were built, leaders sworn to loyalty, alliances forged by both sword and marriage. The war of hearts, like the war of kings, had no clear end. But Alexander did not retreat. He simply moved forward, as he always had, believing that even the most divided lands could be drawn together not by force alone, but by understanding, respect, and the courage to change. In Roxana's eyes, he saw that future. And in those cold mountains, among tribes and rebels, he began to build it one heart at a time. Chapter 10. Into India's Rain and Fire. By 327 BCE, the known world lay behind Alexander. From the shores of Greece to the deserts of Egypt, from Babylon's gardens to Bactria's icy peaks, his name carried the weight of victory, and yet he still felt unfinished. Beyond the horizon lay a land of myths, India, spoken of in Persian palaces and Greek scrolls as a place of gold, wisdom, and beasts that dwarfed all imagination. Alexander was not content to hear tales. He wanted to see it for himself. And so, with his veterans trailing behind and new Eastern recruits swelling his ranks, he crossed the towering barrier of the Hindu Kush and descended into the Indus Valley. What awaited him was unlike anything he had seen. The land pulsed with color and life. Thick forests buzzed with insects and birds. The air clung to the skin, heavy with heat and moisture. Rivers coursed like silver veins through emerald fields. Temples rose above dense groves. The people spoke unfamiliar tongues, wore vibrant fabrics, and practiced rituals that seemed older than empires. This was not Persia. This was something entirely new. The first resistance was scattered small kingdoms, local rulers. Pockets of defiance quickly swept aside by his disciplined phalanxes and cavalry. But the land itself offered new challenges. The monsoon rains fell like curtains of silver, turning roads to mud slowing wagons and soaking soldiers to the bone. Disease crept through the camps. Morale flickered. Still, Alexander pressed on. Then came King Poros. He ruled a powerful kingdom near the Hydaspes River, and unlike others, he did not yield or flee. Porus stood tall, literally and figuratively a man of great stature, commanding a force of infantry, cavalry, and something new to the Macedonians, war elephants. Dozens of them, armored and trained for battle, towered over men and horses alike. They had been bred not just for power, but for terror. When the two armies faced each other, the river surged between them, swollen by the monsoon. Many thought Alexander would wait, but instead, he moved under the cover of darkness and storm. He led a small force up, crossed through rain and flood, and emerged behind the enemy lines at dawn. The surprise was complete. The battle that followed was brutal. The elephants charged, crushing and throwing Macedonian ranks into disarray. Horses panicked. The ground became a swamp of blood, water, and shattered spears. Alexander's tactics were tested like never before. He directed his men to target the elephants' handlers, to flank and swarm, to isolate and confuse the towering beasts. The fight stretched through the day. Victory did not come swiftly, but it came. In the end, the Macedonian discipline and Alexander's timing overwhelmed Porus's army, but the cost was steep. Hundreds lay dead. Thousands were wounded. Alexander himself wept for the losses. Yet what he did next surprised even his closest companions. He summoned Porus, not in chains, but in honor. When asked how he wished to be treated, Porus replied, like a king. Alexander smiled. That is exactly how you shall be treated. He returned the kingdom to Porus, now as an ally, not a subject. He admired the man's courage and resolve. To Alexander, valor was a language more powerful than bloodlines or borders. But even as new territories were claimed, a different battle was brewing. His soldiers, many of whom had marched with him for a decade, grew restless. They had crossed mountains, deserts, and now jungles. They had fought unknown enemies in unfamiliar lands. They longed for home, for the markets of Pella, the wine of Thessaly, the warmth of families left behind. The further east they went, the more they asked, where does this end? Alexander tried to rally them with visions of further glory. He spoke of reaching the edge of the world, of sailing past the great river into lands no Greek had ever seen. He promised wealth, fame, and eternal remembrance. But words no longer stirred their hearts. At the banks of the Hyphasis River, they refused. Officers and common soldiers alike stood their ground. They would go no farther. Alexander was furious. For the first time, his will met resistance not from enemies, but from his own men. He withdrew alone into his tent, refusing food, speaking to no one. Days passed. Then, at last, he emerged, not defeated, but changed. He addressed his army not with anger, but with understanding. They had given him everything, and he would ask no more. He agreed to turn back. The decision was not easy. He had dreamed of unbroken conquest, of touching the ocean at the world's edge. But an empire could not be built on broken spirits. So he ordered a return not by the same road they had come, but southward, along the rivers, through lands still unmapped by Greeks. New cities were founded, alliances made, and the river became both path and memory. The retreat was no less epic than the advance. Through floodplains and deserts, the army returned, weary but intact. Alexander, once insatiable in ambition, began to look inward. thinking now not just of conquest, but of legacy. His march into India had shown him the limits of men, not just their strength, but their longing. Even he, God-touched and world-spanning, could not ignore the human heart. In the fire and rain of India, he had faced kings and elephants, rivers and rebellion. But the moment that defined the campaign was not the crossing of a river or the fall of a kingdom. It was the moment he listened to his men. At the farthest edge of ambition, he had turned back not in weakness, but in wisdom. Chapter 11. The Journey Home and a Shattered Body. The road home was meant to be a return to triumph, but for Alexander, it became a march through shadow. After years of relentless conquest, he turned his army westward not to rest, but to prove one final point. Instead of taking the easier route by sea, he chose the Gedrosian desert. Perhaps it was to test himself. Perhaps it was punishment for failure, for ambition, for dreams left unfinished. The Gedrosian wasteland was no ordinary obstacle. It was a crucible of wind and sand, heat and hunger. The terrain stretched endlessly, marked by jagged cliffs, choking dust and searing sun. Wells were dry, rivers vanished beneath cracked soil. What little water they found was often brackish, deadly. Provisions ran low. The blazing sun shattered morale. Men fell where they walked. Camels collapsed. Soldiers tore apart their own tents to shade the dying. There were no battles in the desert, only silence and suffering. Alexander pressed forward, walking beside his men, refusing to ride. His cloak was soaked with the same sweat as theirs. He shared their rations, drank what they drank, barely enough to survive. But solidarity could not save them. Thousands died in the sands, nameless and unburied. This was no victory march. It was a procession of ghosts. When they finally emerged from the desert's grip and reached the safety of more fertile land, they had lost more men than in any single campaign. The army that had crossed continents had been reduced not by enemy spears, but by the sun and thirst. And Alexander, though alive, was changed. He had once seemed immortal, forged by gods and destined to reshape the earth. But now his body bore the weight of his choices. The years of war had left scars too deep for skin to hide. He had buried friends, companions, generals. His beloved horse, Bucephalus, who had carried him since his youth and shared every great charge, was gone, died in India, far from home. The loss cut deeper than any wound. Bucephalus had been more than a mount. He was memory made flesh, a living symbol of Alexander's ascent. Now, like so much else, he was gone. When they reached Babylon, the city opened its gates with celebration. But inside its walls, Alexander was quieter. The cheers of crowds echoed off palace walls, but he did not answer them with the same energy. He drank more often. He spent long nights in silence, staring into the distance as if searching for something only he could see. Yet even in exhaustion, his dreams did not sleep. He spoke of new campaigns of Arabia, of sailing past the edge of the known world. Plans were drawn. Ships were built. Ambassadors sent. He envisioned harbors that did not yet exist. Cities that would one day rise on distant shores. His empire was vast, but his ambition remained vaster still. And yet, his body had begun to betray him. Years of battle, long rides, sleepless nights. Wounds ignored, all of it had accumulated like a shadow growing behind him. Then came the fever. It struck in early summer, sudden and without mercy. Some said it came from a wound reopened. Others whispered of poison, of plots, of silent revenge. But most believed it was simply the cost of a life lived too intensely. For days, Alexander lay still in the royal palace, surrounded by generals and physicians who could do nothing. He drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes he called out names of his mother, of Hephaestion, of gods only he could see. Other times, he said nothing at all. The empire held its breath. Soldiers gathered outside the palace, pleading to see him one last time. In a final act of strength, Alexander was lifted from his bed and carried past them, too weak to speak, but raising his hand in farewell. His eyes, once filled with endless ambition, now seemed distant, as though they were already watching something no one else could see. On the 11th day of the illness, the question was finally asked, "To whom do you leave your empire?" The room was silent, his breath shallow, his lips barely moved. But the answer came clearly enough to change history, to the strongest, and with those words ambiguous, defiant, prophetic, the boy from Macedonia, who had crossed the world and bent kings to his will, passed from life into legend. He was only outside, the empire he built without blueprint, stretched from the Ionian Sea to the Himalayas. But inside the palace, one body lay still, its spirit spent, its journey finished. The men around him were silent. They had followed him across deserts, climbed with him over mountains, charged into battles beneath his banner. Now they faced a world without him, an empire without direction, a future no longer held in one hand. In that moment, the greatness of his life became clear, not just in conquest, but in what it left behind, a realm too large for any one man to rule, and a legacy that would echo across centuries. Chapter 12. The Empire Without Borders. Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BCE, just shy of his 33rd birthday. A man who had crossed deserts, scaled mountains, and bridged civilizations was brought low not by an enemy's blade, but by fever and time. His body, once strong enough to ride for days and lead from the front in battle, could no longer contain the fire of his ambition. But even as his breathing ceased, something larger began. His empire, the largest the world had yet known, had no precedent and no successor. There was no clear heir, no singular authority strong enough to grasp what he had built. His generals, loyal, proud, ambitious, gathered around his empty throne, not in mourning alone, but in calculation. They divided the realm not as stewards, but as rivals. The land was carved like treasure, Egypt to Ptolemy, Asia to Seleucus, Macedon to Antipater and Cassander. The wars that followed were brutal, long, and inevitable. The empire Alexander forged fractured into pieces, each claiming a share of his legacy, but none able to hold the whole. Yet even as borders were redrawn and power contested, his influence deepened. It was not just land he had conquered, but imagination. Along the roads he had marched, cities rose 70 or more, many bearing his name. Alexandria being the most famous, a city that would one day house the knowledge of the ancient world. These cities became centers of trade, of learning, of exchange. Greek temples stood beside Persian palaces. Coins bore his image in lands where his face had never been seen. In the streets of Babylon and the ports of Egypt, languages blended, customs intertwined, and a new world quietly began to take shape, one in which East and West were no longer opposites, but threads in the same fabric. Alexander had not only moved armies, he had moved ideas. His conquests carried philosophy, art, and governance into the East, while the wisdom of Persia, India, and Egypt flowed back into Greek thought. He encouraged marriages between his soldiers and local women, adopted foreign dress, and honored local gods alongside his own. To the conservative Macedonians, this seemed strange, too foreign, too soft. But to Alexander, it was the beginning of something new, a world not divided by culture, but enriched by it. His dream was not merely an empire of land, but of spirit, a harmony forged from difference. It is why, centuries after his death, people still debated not just what he had done, but who he truly was. To some, he remained a conqueror, brilliant, ruthless, and insatiable. To others, he was a visionary, a philosopher king who dreamed beyond his time. In some lands, legends grew that he was not born of man, but of gods. He appeared in poems, in myths, in sacred texts. In Persia, he was remembered both as a destroyer and a restorer. In Egypt, he was declared the son of Ammon. In Greece, he became the golden standard by which ambition was measured. He existed simultaneously in memory and in myth, blurred between the real and the imagined. And perhaps that was fitting, for Alexander never saw the world as fixed. To him, there were no true boundaries, only barriers waiting to be crossed. His life was not about what was, but what could be. Mountains were not obstacles, but invitations. Rivers were not endings, but paths. And the horizon was never a limit, but a question. What lies beyond? His was a life lived forward, always seeking, never settling. Even in his final days, weakened and worn, he dreamed of new worlds of Arabia, of the great seas beyond India, of unknown lands, yet unnamed. His body failed him, but his mind never slowed, and that, perhaps, is what makes him eternal. Empires fall, stones crumble, names fade, but ideas endure. And Alexander's greatest legacy was not his territory, but his belief that the world could be larger than anyone had ever dared to believe. Today, his cities still stand. His name remains carved into history. His path, drawn across ancient maps, reminds us of a time when one man sought to unite the corners of the earth, not through fear alone, but through imagination. He was not the first to conquer. He was not the last. But he was the one who, in his short, relentless life, refused to accept the world as it was. He reshaped it not just by force, but by vision. In that way, Alexander was never truly of one place. Not Macedonian alone, not Greek, not Persian. He belonged to all and none. He became a symbol carried across ages, whispering to each generation that more is always possible. Not just a man who changed the world, but one who dared to ask if the world had limits at all. And in his asking, he ensured that history would never forget the name Alexander, not simply as a king, but as a force without borders.